welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine, and today's podcast, we're going to be talking about the different types of therapy that are available nowadays. We're specifically going to be covering dialectical behavioral therapy. In order to cover dialectical behavioral therapy, which I will be referring to as DBT, because that's what everybody calls it, and the name is a mouthful. We're going to have to talk about the originator of DBT, Marsha Linehan, and the place it originated, which is called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. We're going to talk about who winds up in this kind of therapy, how this therapy works, a few of the management tips that this therapy provides, and what makes it different from talk therapy, which is the kind of therapy that most of us think of. So, DBT and CBT you may have heard of, and there are specific types of therapy that are becoming really common nowadays, which is really cool because talk therapy is what most people think of when they think of therapy. When they say, I go to therapy, it is assumed that you're going to a therapist's office or maybe in your own house via Zoom or Skype or whatever now. And you just kind of talk about your life. You talk about your experiences. You talk about how you're doing now, the things that you struggle with, the things you're doing well, insights that you're having into your own processes and into the interpersonal dynamics that you experience at home and at work and all the things that make up life. And that hasn't really changed much since Freud. Talk therapy has its place, but it is limited in what it can do, and it's usually pretty roundabout. It's a very circular, cyclical type of intervention that's meant to be explorative and uncover things in a natural way. The types of therapy that we're going to be covering today are different. They are very directed, and that I really like. I really like the fact that they're quite directed. So the primary subject we're going to be talking about today is dialectical behavioral therapy, or DBT. And what separates DBT from CBT, what cognitive behavioral therapy and DBT have in common is, well, a lot. DBT is actually cognitive behavioral therapy plus a real focus on mindfulness. They consider mindfulness to be the foundation of DBT, and I think that's fantastic. Like I said, both of these are directed therapies, and that also means that they are time limited. Typically, a CBT course is 6 to 10 sessions that you work with a CBT trained therapist, and that's something that you should be looking for. I'll say right up front. This is a podcast. I'm not a therapist. I know things, and among the top of the things that I know is that I'm not a therapist. So find yourself a good therapist if you think this stuff sounds good for you, one that is trained in DBT and CBT, especially DBT. I really like DBT, and I'll get to why in a little bit. But CBT is a focused form of therapy. It's short term. It is about what happens inside us as a result of the things that actually happen to us. I've said a million times in this podcast that trauma isn't what happens to you. It's the wound that you carry inside due to the interpretation that you had of what happened to you. And CBT kind of says the same thing. It's not about what happens, it's about our interpretation of what happens. And that's kind of the general theme of CBT. And one of the biggest things that CBT has you do is called thought tracking. And thought tracking is meant to allow us to keep track of our automatic thoughts, because it's not about what happens to us, it's about our interpretation of what happens to us. And that interpretation happens because of the narrative that we have going on inside. There's a lot of automatic thoughts that some stimulus happens and we respond to it emotionally, and then our mind takes over and we go down some rabbit hole. And most of the ways that our mind takes over are automated. And so thought tracking is meant to help you know what your automatic thoughts are. What are the thoughts that are driving your experience? Because again, it's not about what happens to us, it's about our interpretation that creates our experience. So by keeping track of your thoughts, you're able to better understand what the stimulus was and the track that your mind takes to create your experience. So let me back up for a second and say that CBT is not for everybody. DBT is not for everybody. I think it basically should be, but CBT and DBT, especially DBT, was created by a woman who had borderline personality disorder, BPD, and DBT is really not exclusively for, but very heavily geared toward borderline personality disorder. Some of the reasons that people might have an interest in CBT or DBT, or maybe their therapist says, hey, maybe you should try these things. One of the primary reasons that you might get referred to or be interested in CBT is if you're self-harming. If you talk to a therapist about self-harm, then they might suggest CBT. Part of the reason is because we're trying to figure out through CBT what the underlying assumptions are that are driving our automatic thoughts, which drive our experience, which becomes so negative that we just want to feel something. And pain is better than nothing for some people. If you were one of those people, CBT, DBT might be really good for you. Another reason, and this is my version, again, I'm not a therapist, but from what I can tell, complex PTSD is a really important factor to consider for people who are seeking therapy and want help. Complex PTSD, there are 12 kind of agreed upon signs. And again, even if you get all 12, this is a podcast. But if 7 or more of these you consider to be true for you, then it might be worth talking to a therapist and seeing if CBT or DBT might be right for you. The number one sign out of the 12 signs that you might have, that you might be suffering from complex PTSD, is that you experience, number one, nothing as safe. Nothing is safe to you. Maybe you don't think you're going to die. Most likely you don't think that you're going to die, but you're always on guard, waiting for something to happen that you're barely going to be able to handle. Number two is you cannot relax. And this means physically as much as it does any other way. You have such a hard time relaxing that you dislike touch. A lot of times there's bowel problems that go along with it because our digestion is directly tied to our stress. A third sign is you can't sleep. You wake up super early and you wake up kind of startled. That's a sign that you might have complex PTSD. If you have a horrible, horrible self-image, that's another sign that you might have complex PTSD. If you tend to pick highly unavailable partners, there's sign number 5. If you really dislike puppy people, people who follow you around and cling and are adorable, you find that kind of behavior terrible, that's another one. If you are highly paranoid, and as in you expect hostility everywhere that you go, and expect hostility even from places that seem like it should be okay, things should be safe, maybe friendships or just in public, that kind of paranoia, subclinical, but a sign that you might have complex PTSD. If you really, really prefer being alone over being with people, that also might be a sign that you have complex PTSD. If you believe that just living life is unpleasant, you don't really want to kill yourself maybe, but being alive is just not, it's not the thing, it's just not your faves, then that might be another sign that you have complex PTSD. There's a lack of spontaneity in a lot of complex PTSD folks. Again, none of these go for everybody, but there is a regimentedness and a sense of control that is really important to understand that this need for controlling your life has a lot to do with your emotional lability, your extreme emotional reactions to things. So you create a very regimented life in order to prevent those extremes. And because of that, you lack spontaneity. That's another sign. And lastly, you might be kind of career focused, or you get really externally focused to avoid being with yourself. That you really dislike holidays, and not just Thanksgiving and Christmas. I mean, days off, times where you're not focused on something external to accomplish something. That might be a sign that you have complex PTSD. Complex PTSD and borderline personality have a lot in common. They're not the same thing, but I really, really believe they have such similar roots. They're just different categories of classification of how the neurology of the developing child came to be. So CBT and DBT can be really good for people with complex PTSD. It's really good for people who are considering self-harm. And CBT, like I said, it's short. It's usually no more than 10 sessions. You work with a CBT trained specialist, and CBT's been around a little while longer. Marsha Linehan is a psychotherapist who created DBT basically from the inside out because she experienced borderline personality disorder, which is the number one reason that people wind up usually going to DBT. She was a practicing psychotherapist who thought that having to constantly refer out patients who were struggling in the same way that she was just like less than ideal. She wanted to be able to do something for them. So she created DBT. And DBT is very similar to CBT, like I've said, but DBT has this additional focus of mindfulness. DBT has 4 basic modules inside it. Each module covers a different arena, and the very first module that you cover in DBT is a mindfulness module. It's the foundation of everything that they do, because what we're trying to do through mindfulness is reestablish a connection with ourselves, with our own body, with our own experience, and how our experience manifests itself. There's a lot going on under the hood of the human being that we don't notice, and a mindfulness and meditation component really helps us to be able to see under the hood, to be able to watch what happens inside of us and understand the tendencies that we have. And through understanding those tendencies better, we can predict our own behaviors a little bit earlier, and we can find ways to stopgap the behaviors that we don't like. Which ties perfectly to the specific goals of DBT. In the 6-month DBT program that I went through, where we met weekly for 2 hours, I freaking loved this program, by the way. I absolutely loved it. When you're working with a DBT practitioner, you're going to be working with one-on-one therapy with your therapist, and you're going to be in group therapy. And the group therapy is 2 hours. You usually have 1 hour with your therapist. It's an intensive program, like I said. What we think of as regular therapy can be very roundabout, and it's very circular and cyclical and explorative. This is also very explorative, but it's explorative in a kind of prescriptive way. And that's really useful for a lot of us, because not everybody can afford therapy that doesn't have like the most bang for your buck. In fact, I would say most everybody, especially those of us who really need therapy, we can't afford to just talk in circles about our childhood and about this memory and that memory and all that kind of stuff. So I'm really thankful that CBT and DBT are a thing now, that they've been created in this very focused manner to help us understand our own experiences. And so when you first start a CBT or DBT program, I'll just be talking about DBT from here on out, but now you know they're similar. You originally establish some specific goals. You establish behaviors that you would like to decrease and skills that you would like to increase. The front of my book, in the handout 1, there are 5 behaviors to decrease with little check boxes beside them so you can check whichever ones are most important to you, and 4 skills to increase. What we're trying to decrease is mindlessness, emptiness, being out of touch with self and others, or judgmentalness. We're also trying to decrease interpersonal conflict, stress, and loneliness. We're trying to decrease the absence of flexibility and the difficulties with change. We're trying to decrease the ups and downs in extreme emotions, mood-dependent behaviors, and difficulty in regulating our emotions. And we're trying to decrease our impulsive behaviors, the acting without thinking that we all do, the difficulty accepting reality as it is, and willfulness, trying to decrease our addictions. And the things that we're trying to increase are mindfulness skills. We're trying to increase our interpersonal effectiveness skills, and we're trying to increase our distress tolerance. And you guessed it, if you counted right, there's 4 there, and there are 4 modules. The first of which is mindfulness. The second is interpersonal effective, then followed by emotion regulation, and followed lastly by distress tolerance. There's a note underneath there where you get to write your personal goals. And so my personal goals of behaviors I wanted to decrease is I wanted to decrease my own negative self-talk. And I wanted to decrease the amount of crosstalk that happens in my head, of when I have an idea and I think it, then another voice comes in and shuts it down before I can even flesh out whether it was a good idea or not. That cross-talking eliminates my ability to brainstorm about things, and I don't like that. So those were my 2 that I really wanted to focus on personally through DBT. As far as behaviors I wanted to decrease. As far as behaviors that I wanted to increase, I wanted to increase my observation skills more than anything else. And really what that boiled down to was increasing my mindfulness skills, because that's what mindfulness does. It increases observation, but not just of what's around you, but what's also happening inside you. And so as you move through a DBT program, these goals that you establish early on are really important. There's a whole section where you talk about goals and the importance of goals, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to self-direct our own behavior. We're trying to self-direct our activities in the world and our reactions, and trying to make them measured. And we can't do that if we don't have a goal. If we're just like, well, I want to be better. Well, what does that look like? If you don't know what better looks like, then you will fail every time, because you have no way to measure your success. So it's really important to set up these own personal goals and be really present with this, because it is hard work. These programs are hard work, but man, they're awesome. And especially, I loved the group therapy, because you get to see other people going through their own version of the same thing, and everybody's sharing, and it's a really marvelous experience. I want everybody to go through DBT, especially chronic stress adapted people. We all need to go through DBT as far as I'm concerned. And CBT is great, but you've probably put together through the last year that I've had this podcast that I'm a big fan of mindfulness. I think that free will escapes us all without mindfulness. I just don't think that it's possible. So that's why I really am focusing on DBT here, because I think the mindfulness component added to CBT makes it just so much more powerful. So now I'm going to move through some of the early, basic fundamental understandings, some of which I've covered earlier in this podcast and previous episodes. Some of it will be new. I'm not going to go through all of it because there's too much. I went through a 6-month program. This book that I have that I'm getting a lot of this information out of is the book that I used through my program. It's one of 2 dialectical behavioral therapy books that I have, and it's wonderful. And I think one of the most important to understand is, it's the 3rd handout in this very first module. And it's on mindfulness. But the way they break it down is that we have 2 minds. We have the reasonable mind and we have the emotion mind. Or I like to call it the rational mind and the emotional mind, because both of them are reasonable. I've talked about how emotions are logical. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you think that emotions are completely illogical, go listen to that podcast. It's a great one, and it's really important to understand that our emotions are logical. They're just operating with different data than our rational mind is, and they're trying to deal with a different arena of life. The immediate versus the rational mind is looking at our future and our past. So the reason I'm bringing this up is it's so important to understand that we have a rational mind and we have an emotional mind. And they're like the 2 horses of a chariot. One is pulling us down a very emotional path, and one is pulling us down a very logical path. The rational mind seems cool and rational and task-focused, and the emotional mind feels more hot, more mood-dependent, and is emotion-focused, obviously. When you're in your rational mind, you're ruled by facts, reason, pragmatics, values, and feelings are not very important. And when you're in the emotional mind, the exact opposite is true. You're ruled by moods, feelings, urges to do and say something. Facts, reason, and logic are less important. And thirdly, we have the wise mind. The wise mind, we're called Homo sapiens. Sapien meaning wise. And I think that what makes us human, hopefully, I love the parallels in the naming of this, because as Homo sapiens, as the wise man, it's our job to find and activate our wise mind. And what the wise mind does in a little Venn diagram is it sits in the overlap of our emotional and rational mind. You could, if you wanted to separate the hemispheres into right and left of emotional and reasonable, and that is not anatomically accurate whatsoever. But if you did that, you can think of that Venn diagram in the middle of being your brain STEMmy stuff. That's the basic basal things that keep us alive, like breathing and heart rate and that sort of stuff. And I think it's wonderful that breath is a primary focus of mindfulness, because it does allow us to access both our rational and our emotional minds. And our job as a Homo sapiens, as the wise man, is to get both of our chariot horses to go down the same damn path. That we have a path that we would like our life to take, at least some general idea. And again, this refers back to the importance of goal setting. But once we have a goal, we try to point ourselves in a general direction on a general path to achieving that goal. And that goal exists in the real world, where there are both logic that is important and there is emotion that is equally important. And our wise mind is how we bring these 2 together. And that is a huge, huge component. I can't say it's the biggest. There's a million massive components. But I think this concept, it's not just a DBT concept. This is the concept of the observer in mindfulness. There's peoples all over the world from many different cultures that have developed a very similar idea to this. But the idea is that there is something beyond your rational mind. There is something beyond your emotional mind. There is something beyond both of those that can encompass the 2. And when we try, we can get both of those horses on the same track, and we can lead a wise life. And if emotions are hot and logic is cool, then the wise mind feels timid. And the wise mind understands that there is wisdom within every person. It sees the value in both reason and emotion, and it brings together the left and right brain. The last key phrase that they have under here is the middle path. How Buddhist is that? That's what they call Buddhism, is the middle path. All right, and there are 5 major handouts. There's like handout 5A, 5B, 5C, so there's actually more than 5. But there are 5 basic handouts in the mindfulness regimen, in the mindfulness module. The second module moves into interpersonal effectiveness, and this is really important for those of us who might benefit from this, whether you're a highly sensitive person or borderline personality or complex PTSD, for all the reasons that we've talked about before. It's really hard to hold relationships together. We tend to have much more extreme emotional responses to stuff than our less traumatized or less stress-adapted counterparts may have. And because of that, especially the people who are closest to us, especially if we have like complex PTSD from childhood and chronic stress, it gets really intense when we feel. We feel super strongly, and because of that, we really struggle in our relationships because we either have such dramatic reactions to things that it becomes hard to hold on to the relationship, or we choose partners who are basically dead on the inside because at least they don't have any reactivity that we have to deal with. We only have to deal with our own. But if they're avoidant and you're reactive, their avoidance is going to activate your reactivity, and then you're going to cling harder and they're going to avoid harder, and it becomes this terrible dance. So interpersonal effectiveness is the module that is thrown in to help us navigate how do we compromise with the things that we need without giving up ourselves, because that's really hard. A lot of us have been trained to live on crumbs and to deny our own needs and our own stuff for the benefit of everybody else around us. And that's never more true than in romantic relationships, whether we like it or not. And so interpersonal effectiveness basically has you asking, when you're navigating a conflict with somebody, you're taking into active account what is the goal that you want, and you're thinking about this explicitly. DBT really teaches you how to think. Like it should be taught in all schools, is like in K through 12 school as far as I'm concerned, because it teaches you how to critically think about how to navigate the things that really matter in life. And the things that really matter are our own goals that are going to give us a sense of purpose and a sense of duty, and the relationships that we have. Our quality of life is determined by our quality of relationships. But sometimes at work or at home, there are situations that come up that are hard to navigate, and you get a no from a person that you have to continue to deal with, and they stopped you from doing this thing that is really important to you. And so the interpersonal effectiveness section is really asking about, what are your goals with the relationship, and what are your goals with this conflict, with this very specific situation? And learning to look at those and balance those out. Is this person really important to you as an individual? How important is that relationship to you? Well, if that's a really important relationship, then you should err to the side of maintenance of the relationship and making sure that whatever the outcome may be, that you phrase things in a way that you're not threatening the relationship itself. Whereas if this is a stranger, your relationship with them doesn't matter. You can kind of say whatever you want so long as it's within your own value system, which is another big theme of DBT, understanding what your own value systems are and not crossing your own moral lines. That's a big part of it, because we get really mad and we self-sabotage hard when we cross our own value lines. So that's kind of the purpose of the interpersonal effectiveness section. Then the next one that you'll get into if you work with a DBT therapist is emotion regulation. So the goals of emotion regulation are to understand and name your own emotions. Again, these are things that we should have been taught. These are things that we were taught. But a lot of times we weren't taught very accurately. Our parents weren't psychotherapists. And even if they were psychotherapists from 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And the access to knowledge that they had and the knowledge that they had was totally different. So as a child, you fall down, you scrape your knee, and it hurts. You learn because somebody explains to you what pain is, what anger is, what sadness is, what frustration is. Because they're like, oh, are you feeling frustrated? And the kid starts to agree. And it's like, oh, okay, this is what frustration is. That's what we're reestablishing in emotion regulation. The first goal is understanding and naming your emotions. This is where the whole name it to tame it kind of concept comes from. Then there is the decreasing the frequency of unwanted emotions. And in that section, you learn to stop unwanted emotions from starting in the first place and changing the unwanted emotions once they do start. The third goal of emotion regulation is decreasing your emotional vulnerability, decreasing your vulnerability to your own emotional mind, and increasing your resilience, which is really just saying increasing your ability to cope with difficult stuff. And then the last goal is decreasing emotional suffering, which is slightly different from decreasing emotional vulnerability. Decreasing the emotional suffering is focused on reducing suffering when painful emotions do overcome you. Because Marsha Linehan did an amazing job creating this from the inside out as a person with borderline personality disorder. So she understands that no matter how hard you try or how well you set things up, sometimes you do become overwhelmed by your emotions. And so the final goal of this module is decreasing the suffering once you have been overcome by your emotions, learning to manage those emotions so that you don't make things worse. That's the biggest problem that we have when we're overwhelmed, is once we're overwhelmed, it's easy to fall into what shame does, which is it just wants to propagate itself. When you're really overwhelmed, it's like we just want to make things worse. So minimizing suffering is largely based around when you are overwhelmed, learning to not make things worse. So that's the third module of DBT. And if you ever do go into DBT, there are a bajillion different acronyms in DBT. They really love their acronyms. There are acronyms to help you remember just about everything. And for the last module, DBT brings up distress tolerance. And distress tolerance is a lot like the last goal of the third module. It's about not making things worse. That's really it. Distress tolerance is about not making things worse. It's about learning to accept the reality as it is. And there's another form of therapy that's out there now called ACT therapy, which is acceptance therapy, acceptance something. But it's another one that's based on radical acceptance. And in the distress tolerance module, we're focused on accepting reality and replacing suffering and being stuck with ordinary pain and the possibility of moving on. That's what acceptance does. When you accept that your reality is the way that it is, that it sucks, or whatever it is, when you accept the reality of the situations that you're trying to change, that's the first step to being able to change them. That's the first step to making your extraordinary pain, because it feels extraordinary because you can't accept it. And you can't accept it because it's extraordinary in your own head. It's extraordinary. So you can't accept that. That creates suffering. Suffering is just pain on steroids. It's the pain that we create because of our pain. So this is about turning that suffering back into ordinary pain. And that gives us the chance to move on, to move forward, and to do something differently, to change the ending. The last thing in this section is about becoming free. Become free of having to satisfy the demands of your own desires, urges, and intense emotions. That's what the freedom is. Freedom from all the crap that we lock ourselves into. Life's a crazy, crazy roller coaster for a lot of us. And some of us can really benefit from things like CBT, DBT, ACT. But today's episode, we've did a little bit of a deep dive into DBT. It's a wonderful, wonderful type of therapy that I personally have gone through, and I freaking loved it. It was phenomenal, and it was really cool. I found it late. I wish I could have found it earlier, but also kind of don't, because through my exploration of all kinds of philosophies, from Vedic to Buddhist to Stoic, I've put together my own stuff with my understandings of neurobiology and developmental neurobiology, childhood development, all that kind of stuff, and created some kind of loose schematic for understanding how I came to be, how the world works, like in a nuts and bolts kind of way. And DBT did that. Well, Marsha Linehan created a system that did all of that. I didn't need to reinvent the wheel, but I'm really glad that I did, because like this stuff is in my bones now. And then after being able to do a 6-month program, it's that much more ingrained in me, because each week, if you go through one of these programs, you get homework, you get these handouts, and you cover a skill, because all of this is skills-based. You're not in group therapy talking, this is important, you're not in group therapy talking about like your childhood traumas or talking about the terrible things that have happened to you. A little bit of that comes out, but for the most part, DBT is very skills-based. It's about giving you the tools and the understandings that you need to make your life better for you in whatever way that, whatever that means to you. DBT is about giving you the understanding and the tools necessary for you to change your life and live a life that you find more enjoyable, whatever that means to you. Which is why I want to close this with what dialectical means, because I had to look this up. Cognitive behavioral therapy is pretty easy. Cognitive behavioral therapy. I know those 3 words. That makes sense. However, dialectical, I was like, I don't really know exactly what that means. And when you look it up, it's a little strange. Like the Oxford Dictionary has some stuff that it makes it a little harder to understand. But anything that's dialectical, according to the Oxford Dictionary, says it's relating to the logical discussion of ideas and opinions. The example given is dialectic ingenuity. Dialectical, the second definition, is concerned with or acting through opposing forces. And that's really important, because when you get into better definitions, it's about any systematic reasoning that juxtaposes contradictory ideas and seeks to resolve the conflict. So any dialectical thinking is the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives and to arrive at the most economical and reasonable reconciliation of seemingly contradictory information. I love, love, love that definition. That's from eric.ed.gov. That is my favorite one when I was digging through Google looking at these. That one makes by far the most sense. And I love that Marsha Linehan chose that, because the conflicts that we experience as BPD people, as complex PTSD people, as people who have been injured by living in the modern world, in this post-capitalistic modern world, there's a lot of conflicts, and there's a lot of like hard stops where we just feel really stuck. But if we take the time out of our day, out of our lives, to critically think in a systematic way from many perspectives about what the issues that we're facing are, where they come from, and what the straightest path to solving them is, that's dialectical. And we all face these hardships that seem like there's no way around them. And I love the name dialectical behavioral therapy, because it's about seeming oppositions and finding the commonalities and the most direct path to kind of bridge those two. So that's dialectical behavioral therapy. It's like CBT plus the mindfulness portion. It was created by Marsha Linehan, who is a psychotherapist herself, and it has been proven over and over and over again in clinical settings to be really powerful. It is a focused form of therapy. So you can really invest in this And I know that therapy is unattainable for most people. Regular circular talk therapy is. And so if you want therapy, if you feel like you want or need therapy, but you can't afford it, if there's any way that you can save up enough money to be like, okay, I only need 6 to 10 sessions of CBT. Like I need this limited chunk of time. That's the maximum that you have to save up for, right? If there's a limit to it, it's more doable. And I really appreciate that. I appreciate the bang for the buck that you get out of DBT. I'm really excited to announce that I will be attending a advanced DBT skills course coming up soon. And I think that's another 6-month program taught by people who train all of the DBT therapists around the country. I'm really excited. I'm really excited for that because I can't wait to pick their brains. I love this stuff, and it has saved my life before I knew it was called DBT. I just found DBT and went through that program last year. And it was really helpful because I was going through that program while Key was sick with cancer. So I really had to look at my own stuff and my own reactions because it was a very stressful time for me. And it really helped me to keep my shit together and not be volatile. I really love this stuff. So if you have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder specifically, which basically just means that you're chronic stress adapted as far as I'm concerned, DBT is literally made for you. If you have complex PTSD, which is a PTSD that comes largely from small T traumas over a long period of time, rather than like a big T trauma that happened in a short, acute instance, and then you carry that wound, having multiple forms of chronic trauma is what is often referred to as complex trauma. And that does weird things to our brains, especially if it happens like under the age of 15, like through our childhoods. Again, going back to chronic stress adapted. A lot of the things that those 12 things that I listed that are signs of complex PTSD are all made better, whether you have it or not, whether you have that diagnosis or not. I'm not interested in diagnoses. I'm not a therapist. I'm interested in what do you suffer from and how can you make it better. And that's what DBT is all about. It's not asking you about your mommy and your daddy and all the hugs, although looking at some of that stuff can be beneficial. It can be important. It can be great. But at some point, all the whys just become mental masturbation, in my estimation. They're great. They can illuminate a lot of things, especially at first, but eventually you just wind up going in circles. DBT really focuses your mind on what are the realities that I face, not just rational realities, not just logistics of the material world, but also the realities of your emotional world, the realities of all of that. How can I take all of these things into consideration in a systematic, rational way and use that to live a life that feels better to me? If that sounds like something that you would enjoy, if that sounds good to you, I really hope that you find a DBT trained therapist because it's freaking awesome. All right, now you have made it to the end of another wonderful episode of the Speak Plainly podcast. Thank you very much. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. We covered DBT, how it's like CBT, the originator is Marsha Linehan. We covered the 4 different modules of CBT and a few of the basic fundamental tools and teaching tools of CBT that I find are really important, especially the wise mind. So if you liked this, consider donating on Patreon, consider buying me a coffee. I really appreciate it. I do all of this out of the joy I get from sharing these things that I find important and beneficial. That's why we speak plainly about things that matter. I really believe that DBT matters. Psychotherapy has been largely the same for 100 years, and it's just now beginning to change, and it's been proven to be a very, very powerful tool for certain groups of people. So I hope that you will find yourself a DBT-trained therapist if all of this works for you. Again, thank you so much for listening. If you want to get coaching by me, that link will be in the description below, along with links to all of my other work and a link to the old podcast on emotions being logical. Thank you very much for listening. God bless you all. Spinoza bless you all. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.
Do